Support for this podcast is brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. We take a closer look at our human experiences and use stories to explore culture, history, and contemporary issues. You can find us on thinkwhy.org.
As human beings, like sociologically, we think that if we have the floor and it's our turn to talk, we better thrill everybody or else we don't deserve to speak. Some of the best stories are about really simple moments.
Hello, I'm Emmy DeGrappa. This is What's Your Why? Each week we bring you stories asking our guests the question why. We learn about their passion, why they do what they do, why should we care, and what can we learn? What better place to explore the human landscape than from the state known for its incredible landscapes, Wyoming? And what better organization than Wyoming Humanities? Serving our state for over 45 years, we share stories, ideas, and wisdom about the human experience. Welcome to What's Your Why? Today we are talking to Peter Aguero. Peter believes everyone can tell a story, and he is an educator and storyteller himself. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you.
Tell me how you got started in storytelling.
I suppose I've been telling stories my whole life, like just about everybody. I have a background in performance. I've done a lot of different things. I started out about 20 years ago doing sketch comedy and plays in college, and then in the early 2000s I was doing improv, and I did a little bit of stand-up for about 6 months. I didn't like it, so I stopped doing that. Then I was doing a lot of stage acting. I studied at a studio in New York that was really great. Film acting, all that other stuff. And then about 10 years ago, I went to my first Moth show. Throughout all that time, I'd always been telling stories in one way or the other in the different ways I was performing. And it just seemed like a perfect match. You know, it's a group that's dedicated to the art and craft of storytelling. So I started going to the slams, and there were open mic shows where you could go and put your name in a hat and tell a story on a theme. And I got hooked, and I went to every show in New York for about a year and a half, twice a month, trying to tell stories, but also listening to stories. Every night you'd listen to 10 stories if you didn't get picked. And it just kind of grabbed something within me that was missing in the other art forms I was working in. The thing I think that grabbed me the most was there was no artifice between what was being presented and the audience. There was no character. You're not speaking someone else's words. It's directly from you to a listener. And that's so rare. So that was the thing that grabbed me at first. And I've been doing a lot of that for about the last 10 years in the U.S. and in Europe, through Canada. It's been a really great experience.
The Moth is really well known, but if you were going to give it a definition to explain what the Moth is, tell me what that is.
Yeah, it's a nonprofit that was started in 1997 by a guy named George Dawes Green, who's an author. Did a lot of his growing up in Georgia, and on St. Simon's Island there were a bunch of folks that would tell stories on a porch like you do in the South a lot. The screen had a hole in it, and moths would come in and gather around the light, so they would call each other the Moths. So when George came to New York after writing some of his books, he noticed the people in New York weren't listening to anybody. They were just waiting for their turn to talk. So he was trying to recreate that feeling of what he had on his friend Wanda's porch in Georgia, and the show started in his living room, got more popular, had to move to the back of a bar, got more popular, ended up in theaters, and then on the road, and so on and so on. It's really just, it's a great organization. It really believes that everyone has a story to tell, and there's education elements and curated elements and open mic elements, and it's really accessible. That's one of the things I really like about it. It's very accessible to almost anyone who is looking for it. They can find it and find a way to be included and have their voice added to the collection of stories that the Moth has been able to have. Now at this point, the Moth does shows all over the world, and it's been an amazing thing to see an organization just blow up like that. It's really great.
So you're a consistent host on the Moth?
Yeah, I host one of the slams once a month in Brooklyn, and I host on the road. That's how I got here to Jackson 2 years ago, I guess it was. I hosted a main stage show here at the Arts Center. So I do shows like that around the country, and I'm one of the regular hosts in New York, yes.
How do you help people tell their story?
I really believe that the best stories are simple. They don't have to be impressive. As human beings, like sociologically, we think that if we have the floor and it's our turn to talk, we better thrill everybody or else we don't deserve to speak. Some of the best stories are about really simple moments, about a choice you made or a choice you didn't make, about a mistake you made or a small triumph. Like, it's not really about the crazy things that happen to us. The people that have had crazy things happen to them, they're the ones that mostly believe they have stories to tell. They just have an anecdote about a thing that happened. But everybody has a story about love, about fear, about loss, about joy, about triumph, about disaster. And that's what stories are really about. They're not about the thing that happened. They're about the emotions that we feel. And as human beings, we all feel emotions. We all know what it's like to be afraid, and we all know what it's like to win, and we all know what it's like to be angry. So, of course, some people have more of a knack than they're natural-born storytellers. They're not as nervous being in front of a group of people. But I think everybody has that ability within them if they can turn off the little editor in their head that tells them that what they have to say doesn't matter. Once you realize that it does, even if it only matters to you, then the story has value.
I was thinking about that because when I was reading your biography, just coming from a tough family life and maybe storytelling was your outlet of expression.
I didn't really come across storytelling until later, but growing up wasn't, the most loving family, and, there was no Ozzie and Harriet with it, And I know what I did to survive when I was a kid was to kind of isolate and get away and try to do that, which this is kind of different. It's the opposite. Like, going and telling stories is, instead of isolating yourself, you're trying to show your vulnerability. You're trying to show the parts of you that you don't show anyone else. So what I kind of realized as time went on was I could kind of tell these stories and, in a way, give voice to the younger version of myself that nobody was listening to. So I realized, if I'm talking about something that happened when I was 15 years old and I was really unhappy with the way that turned out, nobody was listening to that 15-year-old kid about how unhappy he was. There was too much going on. So, I have given myself the opportunity to let that 15-year-old kid be heard. And I've found that there's really no statute of limitations on giving yourself that permission. You can kind of take a thing that happened to you a long time ago that you don't think really affected you, and once you start talking about it, you realize it did, and then you can get it out, and then it's not inside kind of curdling away anymore. It's out then. And that's been one of the biggest benefits I've found from telling stories is it definitely gives voice to past versions of myself that didn't have that opportunity. So that kid gets his thing to say now.
Do you think that as a storyteller you need to be more of an extrovert instead of an introvert?
I don't think you need to. You're just going to tell stories in a different way, I know many extroverts that are storytellers. I know many introverts that are too, and it's just a matter of realizing that it's not really even about you. The story exists. The story, the thing that happened and the choice you made exists almost separately from you. So your job is to be a vessel for that story and just relay the story as best you can. So whether or not you're comfortable doing it, whether or not you're comfortable in front of people, speaking in front of people is legitimately a terrifying thing to most people. It's unnatural. It's not the sort of thing that we're brought up to do when it's easy, So if you just remember that your only job is to relay the story, then you can get past all that other stuff. I don't think it's easy you can't say that an introvert or extrovert or male or female or anyone in one way or the other is better suited to tell stories. I think it's a really democratic thing in that anybody and everybody has these experiences, and anybody and everybody can have an opportunity to let your voice be heard.
When you're working with people, like in a workshop or that kind of setting, how do you get people to open up and break out of their shell or get up and say something that might be really uncomfortable? Do you have a technique?
Some. Ultimately it's up to the individual to be how comfortable that they deem themselves to be with what they want to talk about. A lot of times people might enter in a workshop thinking that they want to work on something that was really, really difficult for them to go through, a sickness or a family issue or, some kind of trauma, and they're not ready to talk about it yet. So it usually becomes pretty evident when people don't want to really talk about it because they stay right on the surface. And if you ask a couple questions to try to figure out what's underneath the surface and they're reticent to do that, I stop pushing. It's not up to you. You shouldn't talk about pain until you've processed it. You shouldn't talk about trauma until you're on the other side of it. So, I'm 41. I will be in 2 days, and I'm like the stories that I do now. Usually, if I'm developing something new, if it's not from when I was a kid, it would be stuff from 5 or 6 years ago. Like, I'm not ready to tell stories about stuff that happened to me last week or 2 years ago even, because it's not, I don't have the perspective yet. That's why a lot of times, working with younger kids, teenagers even, they don't have that perspective of what that event meant to them. So, like, it's hard for a teenager to be able to tell a story. So even with an adult, sometimes the thing happens to you when you were a teenager and you end up with some piece of arrested development inside of you, and that piece isn't ready to be on the other side of it to talk about it. That being said, there are ways to get out of your own way, and there's exercises that do that, and one thing I do, I would say, especially if someone's nervous about talking in front of a group of people, you just pick out one person and you tell them the story, and just connect with that one person, and then that one person becomes kind of an avatar for the rest of the audience. As human beings, what we really, really want more than anything else is connection. So that's a way to make a connection when you're with an individual standing in for a room full of people, when you're afraid to try to make a connection with a room full of people. I don't know if that answers your question, but
no, that's really helpful. I think I want to be a good storyteller, but at the same time, as you were talking, I'm thinking, I love listening to your story, and I almost would rather listen to people's stories, which is why I do this, but because that's such an interest of mine, more than me standing up and telling my story.
And that's okay.
Which would be terrifying, actually.
I know, it is. And you know what? I'm going to let you in on something. Okay, first of all, it's okay to be afraid of it. I'm afraid all the time, and I do it anyway. It's not easy. So, that's the fear, it never really goes away. That's all part of it. So it's how much fear you're willing to deal with, I figure you're going to be afraid whether you do it or not, so you might as well do it, right? But then on top of that, you said, I want to be a good storyteller. Don't worry about being good or bad, because again, it's not about you. It's about the story already exists. So all your job is to relay the story as honestly as you can. Your job isn't even necessarily to entertain people. Your job isn't even necessarily to make them hear something they never heard before. Your job is to simply relay that story as honestly as possible. The greatest thing with storytelling, I think, is that we're really dealing with emotions and honesty and truth. And so that's your job, is to be an honest storyteller, not a good storyteller. So, anybody can be a good storyteller. It's about being as honest as you can be.
Do you need to be a good listener?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Fully half of storytelling is listening, just like anything else. When I was doing improv, they taught us all about how listening was the most important thing. And that was something that my acting teacher, hammered into us too, about listening. When you're not telling, you have to listen to other stories. That's all part of it, and also kind of in a way listening to yourself. Like, where are you going with this? What am I saying? Don't get disconnected from the words. Stay direct with yourself. Stay direct in your words. So the listening is an absolutely vital part of being a storyteller.
It's so great to talk to you. I love it. Thank you so much for being here, Peter.
That's my pleasure.
Thank you for listening. I'm Emmy DeGrappa. This Think Why podcast is brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. We use the humanities as a lens to explore the human experience. You can find us online at thinkwhy.org.